Leah, thank you very much. Sara, thank you so much for speaking to us. We're talking specifically here about the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, and this is quite poorly understood, including by a lot of people who actually have bipolar disorder. What is the distinction and why is it important?
Okay, well, thank you so much, David, for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today. The distinction between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 is really critical. And the main difference is that people with bipolar 2 and people down the bipolar spectrum from bipolar 1 do not have mania. And this was very explicitly shared with us last week by Dr. Roger McIntyre out of Toronto. And he's, world authority. He says that 2 out of 3 people that he meets, and actually 2 out of 3 people by the statistics that have bipolar actually do not experience mania. 2 out of 3, the majority. And why is that important? Is because we're consistently misdiagnosed and then given the wrong medications, which make us worse.
I think we work to a definition here in the UK about people who do have hypomania, but maybe not in quite the same way as people with bipolar 1. Your story is quite interesting, and actually it's one of the reasons I'm really interested in speaking to you, because our stories along this road are quite similar. I in common with a lot of people, it took you quite a long time to get diagnosed.
That's right. It took me 25 years from my first bipolar episode at age 21 until I actually finally got the diagnosis that saved my life, which is that I have bipolar 2, which is a form of bipolarity that responds beautifully to bipolar medications and other bipolar treatments. Prior to that, I was misdiagnosed with major depression. Many of us with bipolar 2, with the types of bipolar that don't experience mania, are consistently misdiagnosed with major depression. Why? Because when we go to the doctor, we don't go when we're feeling great. We go when we're, suicidal or having severe symptoms that look exactly like regular depression.
I'm only recently learning the distinction. When I was diagnosed, and this was over 10 years ago, I was told quite clearly by a psychiatrist that I had bipolar disorder, but there was never any discussion beyond that. I was just told that as a diagnosis. And it's only more recently, I've not had an official bipolar 2 diagnosis, but looking at my symptoms and the way it is, it would appear that is the category I fall into. And it's interesting how poorly understood it can be.
It really is. I mean, and this is not only poorly understood by many psychiatric professionals, but by any primary care clinician. And I don't know if it's similar in the UK, I imagine it is, but that 90% of prescriptions for antidepressant in the US are actually written by primary care docs who have little to no training in psychiatry at all. And most people who go to their doctor, most depression or psychiatric concerns will begin in the primary care office. So you show up to your doctor saying, I feel lousy, I can't get out of bed, I don't want to live anymore, I have no joy. And they, check the box and think she's depressed and give you antidepressants, which in my case, in many cases, for people who have bipolar, can make us worse.
It's a little different in the UK with the National Health Service that we have, but I know quite a few times, and it always seemed a bit bizarre to me, even after I was seeing a psychiatrist, I was still occasionally getting called back to my general practitioner who was quizzing me about this. And I'm thinking, well, I'm speaking to somebody who specialises in this. I don't understand why I'm being asked this here as well.
Mm-hmm. And they still don't know. In my story, which I write about in my memoir, it took me 5 psychiatrists. The first 4 got it wrong. And you'd think that, well, they've been trained, but a lot of psychiatrists, depending on when they got their training, were not exposed to the degrees of heterogeneity, let's say, in bipolar. So they don't know. Again, you show up with depression, I think you're depressed.
And you mentioned medication. I mean, that's quite critical because what the treatment you receive can have very different effects depending on your particular form of bipolar disorder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, if you have, if you're misdiagnosed with major depression, you will not be given medications that work for people with bipolar, right? You'll be given an antidepressant. And again, if you are bipolar, they can make you worse. Not in every case, but in a lot of cases. They can trigger mania, which can be a big problem, or they can trigger all kinds of problems. And the irony is then you go back to that same doctor who has the mental model that you're depressed, and he's going to give you more of that drug that makes you worse. By contrast, if you do have bipolar, even without mania, and you're given a mood stabilizer, in my case, I take something called Lamictal and another one, lithium, in small doses. you can respond really beautifully to bipolar specific medications. And that's why it's so important to get the right diagnosis, I think, because then you're going to do the right treatments.
And of course, I mean, medication in itself, even outside of this, is such a difficult process. I mean, so many people have to try so many things. I went through a couple of different meds as part of my treatment and got no real results from them at all. It's the whole thing is a very difficult situation.
It is difficult. It's definitely, to some degree, an art, not a perfect science. And there is some trial and error, I'm afraid. But, in my case, it took me, I had a lot of my own self-stigma about medication. I wasn't going to do it because I was going to be able to take care of myself through diet, exercise, meditation, whatever. And all of those practices turn out to be really important. But they're necessary, not sufficient, I believe, for most people with bipolar. And you're gonna need to have 4 dimensions, which are medication, therapy, support network, and beautiful, behaviors for a healthy brain. I call them practices for a healthy brain.
I've managed to manage without medication for a while just by managing it in other ways and just being more aware of how I am and how my actions manifest themselves. But I'm fortunate in that respect, and I know it's different for everybody, and everybody has a different way of doing it, and some things will work for one person and not work at all for another. And those other factors you talk about, like having a support network around you, are so important as well.
Yeah, I'm working on a documentary based on the memoir. It's a science-based documentary, and as a result of that, I think this is how we met. We've interviewed like 50 scientists around the world, and we're learning a lot of evidence-based behaviors that those of us with bipolar can do to really make a difference. It turns out that there are treatments, that might involve pharmaceutical, but there are also a lot of non-pharmaceutical behaviors and practices we can do to really prevent or hopefully, get better from episodes.
Things like books and documentaries are really important, though, because you mentioned stigma a moment ago, and that's such an issue that we're battling against at the moment, that a lot of people do treat somebody with any sort of mental health condition with a little bit of suspicion. This is why awareness is so important. That, conversations like the one we're having now. I know on my particular journey, there was a landmark documentary by Stephen Fry here in the UK, which must have been about 10 or 15 years ago now. And even I didn't really have a full understanding of what bipolar was about until I saw that. And that was a part of me thinking, well, this sounds remarkably similar to the way I am.
Wow.
And I've heard so many accounts of so many people who found that so useful. But there's a lot more work to do.
Yes. When I finally came forward with my memoir, and I mentioned it took 25 years for me to get the right diagnosis, it was another 15, so you could do the math, 40 years from my first episode until I felt comfortable telling the story because of the stigma, because of internalized shame, because of all of that. And unfortunately, people who don't seek treatment because of the shame and stigma get worse, and even to the extent of taking their own lives, which is tragic. It turns out in bipolar, people with any kind of bipolar, 1, 2, 3, or whatever, are twice as likely to take our own lives as people who live with major depression. So getting help is really a matter of life and death. So how do we crush the stigma? That was one of the missions of my book and of the film, is to crush the stigma, save lives, and maximize healing. And one of the ways we're doing that is by featuring stories like yours and mine of normal people. I say, this is the face of bipolar, a middle-aged lady with, kids and grandkids and a blessed life, let's say. And I think the stereotype of people with bipolar, unfortunately, could be in the streets, incarcerated, unsafe, untrustworthy. Not the case. So in our film, we're featuring these amazing human beings. Maybe you'll be one, David, who are, basically a contrast to that stigma. We have Major General Greg Martin, who was double PhDs from MIT and commanded 10,000 troops in Iraq. We have Dr. David Kubashan, who was the acting Surgeon General in California at like 33. We have an ice climber. We have a former Obama White House intern. We have a psychiatrist. We have lots of really stunning people, artists, and to say, hey, this is the face of bipolar.
It's interesting. And right across the spectrum from real big high achievers, names that you will have seen on the TV and on the radio, right down to people who might live next door to you. This is the big message that we need to get across. Let's talk a little bit about your journey, if we can. We talked briefly about your diagnosis and also the road towards being open about it. It's quite similar to the journey I went through as well. At what point, I mean, even before seeking any professional help, at what point did you think there's something a bit different about the way I am here?
Oh boy. Well, for me, it was very dramatic because I was 21, and at that point, I was, kind of this kid riding high. I was, had great grades at one top university. I was going to med school. I had great friends. I played varsity sports. It was like full speed ahead. And then all of a sudden, like almost classic on my 21st birthday, it was if a switch had flipped, and suddenly I was like in this tailspin down to living hell. And my cognitive function was gone, and I couldn't, I was very social usually, and I locked myself in my room, and I didn't want to see my friends. I couldn't find my way to class, even though I'd been there for 4 years. My coordination was gone. My joie de vivre was gone. And I almost couldn't add 2 + 2. And I'd been, pre-med with 4.0 in science, high grades. And so the contrast was so dramatic and terrifying that I knew something was wrong. This first episode lasted for about 8 months. Now, I should mention that in my case, my mother also suffered terribly, as did my grandfather. But I did not want to accept that I had the same thing that they did, even though I had.
And you were aware of what they had, even at that point. You knew that existed in your family.
Oh yeah, very much so. Now, we didn't have a name for it. We didn't know it was bipolar. I would call them bipolar 2, like me, because I know my mom responded beautifully to lithium. And I think if you respond to lithium, then you're probably going to be bipolar. Most people with regular depression wouldn't respond positively to that. So she and my grandfather have, in retrospect, I think what I have exactly. They suffered brutally, and I watched it growing up. My mom would have 9-10 months at a time where she was incapacitated. Otherwise, brilliant, beautiful, lovely, radiant human being.
It is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle in some ways, I feel. I mean, I think there has been potentially, I mean, I know there have been some cases in my family, and I think there may have been others, and it's because it was so poorly talked about and because nobody wanted to open up about this. When you go back 50, 60, 70 years, I'm almost kind of putting together stories I hear from family members about things that had happened. You're thinking, actually, this might be more significant than you're letting on. But people didn't want to talk about it in, if you go back, to those periods.
They didn't tell anyone. I don't think my grandfather in the 50s told a soul. And he was a leader in his community, and he suffered terribly. My mother, 1960s, 70s, 80s, she wasn't telling anybody. Nobody except our immediate family knew. She wasn't even telling her best friends. So there was no support, and there was extreme trauma, and then complicated or made worse because of the shame and the stigma and the secrets.
What was the point that you first sought some professional help? What was the driving issue? I know just kind of getting over that hump to actually seeing someone in the first place is really not easy.
It wasn't long after that first episode, because I happened to have 1 or 2 friends that were that had a counselor, a therapist, and they set me up with this person. But I didn't see a psychiatrist for 20 some years because
from that first point at which you experienced
I didn't want to. I think it was like 21 years, because at that point I had little kids, and I had twins, and one of them was having severe breathing issues, and we couldn't get to the bottom of what was going on for her. And I was severely depressed. I'm like, I have to do something to get better, to save this kid. So I finally let one of my friends drag me to a psychiatrist, but that was 20 years down the line, because I didn't want to take medication. I didn't want a diagnosis. I had all this internalized stigma. I tell my younger self, I wish that I had gotten help sooner.
It's strange. I've never really been able to identify a starting point. I think it was more of a slow build-up, and there were certainly times in my teenage years where I was clearly suffering some of the effects of this. But at the time, I didn't know what was going on, and neither did the people around me. But I almost got bullied into going to see the doctor by my partner at the time, because she knew that there was clearly something not right, having been with me, for been with me on a regular basis for a period of time and just witnessed that from a more impartial point of view. But from that point, I was fortunate, and then I did get sent to see a psychiatrist quite quickly. I've since found out I was living in a part of the country where they have a particularly good mental health team.
Good.
But I know not everyone is that fortunate.
Right. Absolutely.
How did it feel once you first got a diagnosis? I mean, I've heard a lot of people say it almost feels like a bit of a relief.
I have to say it was a relief because I had this intuition maybe that my mom might have been bipolar, because I knew that lithium worked for her. And now it's many, many years later, and my mom's gone to the next world. And my sister, who's a decade older than me, so she had perspective. And I said to her, I said, Martha, do you think mom must have been bipolar? And I was very sick at the time. I'm like, do you think we need to get me a bipolar doctor? And she luckily was able to find someone. And so that when I went to this person, and here's a big irony, David, after 25 years, he diagnosed me in 15 minutes with 5 questions.
That's very similar to what happened to me.
I'm getting chills now telling you this. I'm just getting chills. It's so not always easy, but in my case, it was super easy to find when you knew the right questions to ask. Boom, done. And because he was so clear, and he was like, stay the course, we know what you have. You're going to get better. And I did.
Yeah, it was almost, I would say it did feel a bit like a relief, because it almost think, well, like, now I've got an explanation to why I've been behaving like this. And I was almost more worried about the potential that he would say, no, actually, there's nothing wrong with you. And then he'd just have to realize that I was a horrible person.
No. Yeah, and because there are treatments that work, that was the other thing. To have a doctor who was so confident about that was very helpful. And now I would tell people, like, because of my book, and because of friends that know me and other ways I've been out there now, I often get phone calls and emails, whatever, from moms in their 40s and 50s. Their 20-year-old just got a diagnosis of bipolar and they're terrified. And I say, congratulations, this is great news.
Absolutely.
And I don't mean to be glib, but it's like, now we know what to do. And there are treatments, and he can or she can get better. And that's good news.
You mentioned before that it took you quite a long time after being diagnosed to be public about it. And exactly the same was true of me. I first told people outside of my tight inner circle last year after about 10 years.
Wow, yeah.
Why? I mean, we're talking about a different time, a different country, a different situation. Why did you keep it quiet for that long?
I was afraid of the reaction of my mostly professional colleagues. In my life previous to being a full-time mental health advocate, I was a professional corporate consultant. I worked in major corporations for like 30 years. I did not think they were going to give me any latitude on this. And I thought I'd lose clients, and I thought, I'd lose esteem. And then I was also concerned for my kids. Would they have a stigma associated with their mom being bipolar, and everybody's judgments about that. So I held it to myself, and it finally shifted around the time of the pandemic.
It's interesting because I'm a freelance journalist, and exactly the same, if maybe even more so, because you think when you are self-employed, the risk that someone will just go, oh, I'm not going to employ him because it might get to the point where I need him to do something, and he might be in another world, and it might never work. And I was really worried when I finally did go public that I'd end up finding my diary suddenly getting quite empty. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. When did you feel confident that you could tell people about? What was the point at which that started to change?
There were some signs, if you will. What happened for me was I had worked on this memoir from 2008. It wasn't until 21, 22 that it got published. So a few years before then, I think I put it away for about a decade. And then one day in the summer, and I had been out on an adventure with some friends. We went out for what you guys would say pub, for your beer and whatever. And she said to me she'd had a rough summer, and I said, why? And she said that my nephew tragically took his own life, and we think he was bipolar. And I found myself responding, so am I, which I never say in public. But I felt this connection with her, and I wanted to kind of, de-shame it, right? Connect and say, yeah, me too. And people usually, no, you, Sara, really? They think of me as high functioning. And yeah, me. So I told her that I'd written a little bit about it. She says, you know what I do? I said, I don't remember. She said, I publish memoirs. Send me some chapters. And long story short, she said, in honor of my nephew, I'd like to edit this for free. So I start to have signs like that, like, maybe I'm supposed to do this. And then
difficult to say no under those circumstances.
Right, no kidding. And then I had a doctor who, Dr. Jim Phelps, who read an early manuscript and he was like, this has to get out there. So I was getting this kind of feedback. And then I think sort of the kicker was my teenage twins, who were 16, I think, at the time. I said to them, guys, I have this dilemma. I got this offer, for this woman to publish it to edit it for free. On the other hand, I'm worried about the stigma. Do you guys care about the stigma? The twins simultaneously said, Mom, you have to do this. Is the most important thing you could do. Don't worry about the stigma. That's your generation. We don't care. Our friends don't care.
I mean, that's really heartening to hear, isn't it? That somebody,
right? And
not to say it doesn't exist in younger generations, but there's a really different. The prevalent view is so different.
Really different. I mean, we learn about it in health ed. We have people who are cutting and people, so they're like, do what you gotta do it. And I was so moved by that, tears coming down my face because it was dark, they couldn't see. And so I felt like they're championing from your teenage kids. It's kind of like, okay, I got to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very similar, but sort of from the other perspective, from my point of view, because I'd been in so many production team meetings for radio and TV programs where we'd been covering mental health issues, and we'd been talking about how important it was to be open about it, how important it was to talk about it, and how critical these conversations were. And I'd sat in these meetings and go, yeah, that's really important. At the same time thinking, I'm part of this problem. I'm sitting here saying, yes, we should talk about it, knowing at the time that I was hiding a diagnosis. And it got to a point where I thought, I can't, not that anyone should feel obliged to be open about it, but I got to the point where I started to feel a bit hypocritical.
Wow.
And then just one night on social media decided, almost on a whim, to just put a video out and say, I have bipolar disorder, and but I feel a lot better about it now because I'm doing things like this, and I'm trying to get the message out there, and I'm trying to be open about it. And as you said, these are the stories. People need to know that people you've seen on the TV, people who live 2 doors down from you,
right,
can be suffering from this.
The couple stunning things for me about, I say coming out in quotes with my story, was that 2 things. One was, I thought I was afraid of the judgment, and I got the opposite. I got so much love. I don't know if that was for you, David, but I just
absolutely the same experience. In fact,
letters, phone calls,
Yeah, especially the way I did it on social media. We all know what sort of hate exists on social media, and I thought at least there'd be some, messages, particularly when somebody's in the media say, "Oh, it's all very well for you," but actually, overwhelmingly, everyone was so supportive, private messages and public, and everyone was so lovely.
And it was healing, right?
Absolutely.
It was so healing. Like I felt like layers and layers of shame that I didn't know I was carrying were released. And I was like, wow, I feel lighter. I feel 10 years younger. It was so healing. And then the second healing thing was that I didn't know anybody with bipolar disorder. I didn't know anybody with walking around. We don't have it on our foreheads. And I have my own, internalized shame thinking, okay, these are people who are, whatever, in the streets are not trustworthy. Well, instead, who do I meet? The people I said about in the film, Dr. David Guichon, Major General Martin, Professor, this one, that one, and the other one. Amazing human beings, yourself. And we keep meeting these amazing human beings. And all of a sudden, I'm part of this tribe that's creative and entrepreneurs and, BBC.
I mean, I had a private message from a colleague who, for obvious reasons I won't name, who's a few years older than me, who messaged me privately on Twitter saying, "Thank you for doing this. I've been struggling with this for years, and I don't feel I can tell anyone about it for all of the reasons that we've talked about." And I thought, well, it's a real shame that they feel like that, but I hope that somebody in their position, a generation down, isn't going to be in that position as a result of conversations like this.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And so what I found out was that all of a sudden now I have this tribe, and what's reflected in my mirror are these people, and it's really phenomenal. And further, for the film, we've identified some researchers out of UC Berkeley, California, that are looking at the disproportionate representation of people with bipolar in all the creative arts and entrepreneurial arts and music, et cetera, which is really fascinating. So that data is there.
Have you found that just knowing about it has assisted? I always sort of compare it to, when you're in the throes of this disorder, that it's almost like being on a moving train. You can't really judge how fast the train opposite you is going because you're not in a stable position yourself. But do you find that you're just better at identifying the situation you're in after a diagnosis?
You mean when I'm in episode?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think you know what you're in, but then the insidious sort of dynamic of this challenge is that when you are in a depressive episode, you can't remember ever having been well. I don't know if that was your case, David. It's like you can't believe your friends and your partners when they say, you're gonna get better. We see you, we know we're here, and you don't believe it. Because I say it's the bipolar depression is lying to you basically. And it's co-opted, it's hijacked your brain, and it's telling you you're never getting better. So there is that, yeah. It's tough.
Absolutely. And I've been fortunate to have a good group, even before I was public about my diagnosis. I've been fortunate to have a good group of people around me who have sometimes almost physically dragged me out of bed and out of the house when I've just been curled up in a ball and not really been able to do anything at all.
Yeah, I mean, me too. And after the book was published, I had a number of people say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know." Well, I wasn't telling them. But then they'll say, what could I do? Or my cousin, my sister, my niece, my nephew, my brother is dealing with this, and I feel like a deer in the headlights. I don't know what to do. How can I help? And so I gave a TED talk, and I came up with 4 things. I hope I remember the 4. If you want to hear them.
Yeah.
I call it my emergency mental health team toolkit, right? So the first thing is, and this reminded me what you just said, reach in. Don't expect them to reach out. They won't. You got to go drag them out of bed. You have to make the phone call. You have to show up because they feel they're in an island of shame and disaster, and they're not going to reach out to you because they don't think they're worth your time. So you got to reach in. That was thing 1. And then thing 2 was just listen. Don't expect that you can fix it. You can't, right? Just don't try to fix it. But you're just listening provides a kind of, like, they're in an island of despair, and you're listening and showing up is really a huge salve and a lifesaver. So you just go for a walk with them. You just listen. Don't try to fix it. But then the third thing for people who do need to do something, but I got to do something. Well, here's what you can do. You can fill the freezer. You can take the kids to school. You can make the phone, make the appointments. You can do the laundry. Because what people don't understand, I don't know if this is your case, David. For me, the cognitive dysfunction is so bad that I can't do any of that stuff. Absolutely, now, they don't see it. I look just like I look now, probably, except for my hair won't be washed, and I won't have a scarf on.
And I find it was a terrible spiral as well, because especially when I was living on my own, the inability to do those small things that you need in your life, like laundry, like kind of cleaning and self-care, that just makes the situation worse. You find you're living in a state that makes you feel even worse about it. Exactly. As I think you said in your TED talk, then you don't want to invite people around because the place looks an absolute mess, and it's just this spiral that gets worse and worse and worse. It's really difficult to climb out of that.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that's really important to try to get across is that when people think depression, they think, oh, she's sad, or but bipolar depression can have, and in my case has, and sounds like in yours, tremendous cognitive impact. Like your brain isn't working. And people who want to help have to understand how incapacitating this is. Imagine they have a broken leg and you ask them to go for a run with you. They cannot, So for me, all of that help was necessary. And I'm really lucky that I had my partner, my husband, Joe, was amazing when we were little kids at the time. And then other friends I have, and they figured it out that they needed a posse. And that's my 4th thing. That you got to have a posse. If you're a support, don't expect to do this alone because you will burn out. So you got to gather the people, and my friends, I'm really lucky to have a gang of women friends. And one of them was in charge, and she set up like a spreadsheet. And she's like, okay, you've got Monday, you got Tuesday, you got Wednesday, you got Thursday, you're filling the freezer, you're taking her, like all the very practical things, almost like it was a little kid or an elderly person. You have to assume that this person cannot do it.
These are the people we all need in our life that are so valuable. We do.
Yeah. And if you're a person in their life and you're wondering, what the heck can I do? Don't expect to fix it, right? You can't, but you can do all these practical things, and it makes a huge difference.
We started this conversation by talking about bipolar 2 and the importance of differentiating. If there's one message you could get across to somebody who maybe knows about bipolar disorder but hasn't looked at it in any further detail, or even somebody who's thinking about seeking medical help that is unsure, I mean, what would that message of awareness be?
If you have like a debilitating, devastating depression and you're not getting better, consider that you may be on the bipolar spectrum. You may have a form of bipolarity. Really? Yes, you could be bipolar, because 2 out of 3 people with bipolar do not exhibit extreme mania. So don't think that you have to be manic to have a form of bipolarity. You may have been, like you said, David, hypomanic. You may have a personality with high energy. You may have a reactivity or angry or something when you're triggered, but you don't have to have extreme mania. So you could have an extreme depression, an incapacitating depression, debilitating depression, and you don't have extreme mania. Consider that you still could be bipolar depressed, bipolar. And then, so I think those are the big messages: bipolar, without mania. And you can get better. You really can, if you get that right diagnosis, because then you get bipolar treatments, because that's what you got. You know, you get diabetes, you get insulin. You have bipolar, you get bipolar treatments, and you really can get better, and you really can thrive with that. And you have agency. You really can have an impact on the quality of your life by the choices that you make around, self-care, which has to do with sleep and diet and exercise and stress management, all those things that are really good for anybody. But if you have a bipolar brain and proclivity to bipolarity, making those choices can really have a huge impact in like a preventive strategy. I think that's really working for me, and I'm grateful for it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It really, really has been great to talk to you and just kind of share what we've been through in different countries and in different positions and in different ways. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're so welcome, David. Thank you.